said, Edgar, I would like, in your studies of consciousness, the first issue is, does consciousness survive death? And I said to him, John, I would love to research that, but I've got to first find out what consciousness is, because we really don't know. And for you folks here, as I have often outlined or framed the issue of the two extremes, the idealistic extreme on one hand, that says all is consciousness, and the extreme point of view is that matter is not really matter, it's just a thought in the universal mind. That's the extreme of idealism, which goes back to Platonic times. And then on the other extreme is scientific materialism and reductionism that says consciousness is only an epiphenomenon of the collision of random collision of matter. It's an accident in nature. Well, I don't believe either one of those two extremes is correct. The truth somewhere is in between. And that's what we've been looking for 35 years, and we're narrowing down. But we still don't have the answer, and nor do we have any definitive experiments in science that we can test, because science is about postulating and finding experimental evidence to validate your postulate. So somewhere in between those two extremes, we're sure there's an answer to this question, what is consciousness? But we still haven't gotten there yet. That is one of the great enigmas, and I'm sure that it is a part of this intersection between general relativity and quantum mechanics that help us understand that. But that's one of the enigmas. We're still wrestling with. And it's one of the tough ones. And if we resolve that in a proper way over the next decades or so, then I'm sure by the end of this century, we'll be able to go outside of this solar system that we're in. But also I can say in a hopeful way, I think we're narrowing in and getting pretty close to the concept of beam me up, Scotty. We're not too far away from that. And that'll help us understand this issue better.
Oh, one more question. Are you looking into, or do you know anyone who's looking into interaction of nanotechnology with perception and consciousness?
With perception?
And
well,
consciousness.
Absolutely. That's fundamental. The whole notion of perception. And just let me, very briefly, I don't want to go on this at length, but the work in quantum holography that my colleague Walter Schimpf in Germany discovered about 14 years ago now, we've been working on that in studying MRI machines, he essentially invented functional MRI by discovering this quantum hologram. And a non-local quantum mechanical concept of the best way to explain it is that we consider in the English language intuition, we call it our sixth sense. And since we now know it's based in quantum holography or quantum properties, it should be called our first sense because it was around long before our solar system and we were around. It is a basic informational structure in nature associated with perception. And we now can understand and demonstrate very clearly that all of our sensory mechanisms are fundamentally tied into this non-local quantum property. Now that's a long dissertation to talk about that, but we now are quite confident that that's true. And that will help lead us to understanding the sensory mechanism and hopefully consciousness and perception in the not too distant future. The whole idea, and I'll give you the most basic clue, the whole idea, quantum mechanics is based upon entangled particles. And if particles are ever entangled and they go apart from each other, they maintain quantum correlation. If we describe quantum correlation as the most fundamental aspect of awareness in nature, then build on top of that, we're getting a pretty good picture of what awareness, perception, and consciousness is all about. Go ahead.
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
Dr. Mitchell, I was wondering what exact parts of the Roswell crash story were confirmed for you at the level of the Pentagon or the Joint Chiefs of Staff?
I'm sorry, repeat that.
What exact parts of the Roswell crash story were confirmed for you at the level of the Pentagon or Joint Chiefs of Staff? And how are they confirmed?
Well, the only thing that was presented was that the Roswell crash was a real phenomenon as opposed to the myriad stories that have been promulgated since then. Let's put it this way. If the Roswell crash were something like a balloon or any of the other half a dozen stories that have been promulgated over the last 60 years, that's one thing. But if it were really what it is, why do you need all these other stories that have been changed over the last 60 years, one after the other, over a period of a large number of years? And when the people involved, including Jesse Marcel, a number of those others who, and Jesse Marcel Jr. has spoken at this conference and had pieces brought to him and saw them as a kid, and other people have described it. I mean, what more do you want? Now, is that evidence that we have right now? No. But these are trustworthy, believable people, and certainly the lore around the Roswell area was ubiquitous and the same story. The only issue was the Roswell crash something local, or was it something alien? And the concept was it was alien, including the bodies that were recovered and taken away from the site.
And were the efforts such as efforts at retro-engineering that have been reported confirmed to you through your sources?
Well, I cannot speak with authority to how much back engineering has really taken place, although in the lore some has, and I would not be surprised to find that some of the current unknown objects or UFO objects are homegrown, but I don't know that for sure, and I can't say one way or the other with certainty.
Another question, were you briefed on the UFO phenomena? Were you briefed on the UFO phenomena during your astronaut training?
No, not at all. It was never even touched upon in the NASA I was with.
Lastly, I would suggest that your manuscript on the weaponization of space, if you can't find a publisher, perhaps you should just put it on the internet. You don't need a publisher.
That is true. At that time, we didn't have an internet when I wrote that. The internet was subsequent. But we may get it done, yeah.
Good morning, sir.
Good morning.
It seems to me that space is one of the big frontiers for exploration, but another one is the deep sea. The oceans.
Oh, yes.
Yes, and I mean, imagine I've seen the photographs of the Earth, you know, from space, and it's mostly water. And during Dr. Greer's disclosure event, one of the witnesses, I think it was Dan Willis, gave testimony from the Navy that something was under the sea that came to the surface and went past a ship. So, being with the Navy, having their access that you've got, could you speculate, or do you have any opinions about what may be under the seas?
Well, I am aware of the stories and the lore just as you are, but I have no more definitive proof of that than anything else. But yes, there are stories such as that. And that's one of what we're trying to do now, I guess, is to get this all really opened up so we can sort facts from fiction and lore and stories, misinformation, disinformation, and what's really going on. That's what